Hello, everyone. My name is John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Brandi Brimmer. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brandi.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about Black women and Civil War medicine. And Brandi's a wonderful person to talk about this. She's the author, most recently, of Claiming Union Widowhood, Race, Respectability, and Poverty in the Post-Emancipation South. And so we'll be touching, on their intersection with the pension office, Black women as Civil War nurses, and much more in our program today. So it should be a good one. Before we jump in, though, just want to say again, of course, thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoy our videos, and if you enjoy this video, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you want to stay up to date with all the programming that we offer here at the Museum of Civil War Medicine, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Those are easy, free ways that anyone can support us. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You'll find a link for that in the description of the video. And for as low as $25 a year, you support programming like this. And we deeply appreciate everyone who has done so so far over the past year and a half during the pandemic here. You've gone a long way towards supporting the museum and its incredible scholarship. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's program. I wondered, Brandi, if maybe you'd tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first came to the field of Civil War era history.
Yeah, so I am an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm situated in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies. I am trained as a historian. I finished a MA in Black Studies at UCLA and went on to pursue the PhD in US history at UCLA. Many of my mentors worked in the areas of slavery and Reconstruction. And that has really formed the basis of most of the topics that I explore, even when we're talking about the 20th century. So that piece came natural. I don't know if the Civil War piece necessarily came natural to me, but slowly I started to inch my way to these questions. And that really came about because of a curiosity about Black women's, and quite frankly, free people, so men, women, and children, their relationship to the federal government. And most of what I had encountered was coming out through the Freedmen's Bureau. And so I was really sort of interested in those questions. I also am deeply interested in social movements and movements for racial equality. So while I had deep interest and a lot of research experience in the 20th or the 19th century, I was always, reading 20th century social justice literature, and also thinking a lot about legacies of slavery. And so it was in the combination of sort of thinking about social movements, thinking about sort of grassroots struggles that is so rich in 20th century civil rights literature, and thinking about a number of biographies that had sort of hit the stage. And so it's sort of interesting because I don't know that it was necessarily obvious at the moment, but I still had this fascination with relationship to the state. And one of my mentors is really sort of a field-changing scholar in the field of socio-legal history. And I didn't necessarily see myself as a legal historian, but she said, she never told me, oh, those topics are too far apart. But as I continued to look at the Freedmen's Bureau, she encouraged me to look at pension records. And to think about relationships to the federal government as something that I could trace out. And I think over the course of trying to understand the pension system and to really understand the women that I was writing about, the women and their stories really sort of mentored me and nurtured me in the direction of Civil War era history. I mean, their stories were so compelling, their experiences were so compelling that I really understood. It became clear to me in order to understand and to tell these stories, I needed to become more steeped in the literature of the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Yeah, sometimes we just kind of fall into it in that way. That can be how it goes. And
Yeah.
you've hit upon at least a relationship that I think is fascinating as well. We've talked a lot about that with various other scholars on our YouTube channel, and we've talked extensively with Chandra Manning about that relationship between the newly freed people and the federal government. It's one that's not static in any way. It evolves and changes, and it's a very compelling story, just as you said, and we're going to explore some of that today.
Yeah.
So as you went about kind of conducting your research, I always like to ask this because I think it's something that people are interested in. What you already talked a little bit about some of the sources that you consulted, but in particular, what sources did you consult to really bring Black voices to the forefront? I know sometimes that can be challenging. It's certainly not impossible, but sometimes you need to do a little bit extra legwork to make that to make those stories and the voices front and center. So what was that process like?
So this is an interesting time to think about and talk about sort of recovering Black voices from archives, which various scholars, in particular, I'm thinking about Maurice de Fuentes and others who have talked about the violence of the archive. And I'm sure we'll talk later. I mean, the pension application process itself, the kind of ideas that circulate within the Bureau are certainly violent. But this was a moment where I like to say that the women themselves are creating the archive. And what I mean by that, they are relentlessly petitioning for benefits promised to them on the basis of their husband's service. And so obviously the pension records became a major source that I consulted. And I know that your audience will have some familiarity, probably a good deal of familiarity with those sources. But I also was very much interested in the Freedmen's Bureau and that sort of relationship, and thinking about the use of Freedmen's Bureau records has been there's a really sort of broad historical or historical conversation using those records. Certainly the Freedmen's and Southern Society Project has done, just incredible work in terms of making those documents accessible, and many other scholars doing this work. So those became the principal points of interest that I looked at. And I'm sure we'll get more into this, but it was also very clear to me that these records were telling me the story of government institutions, which I needed to understand, because I think the women themselves began to understand and became more familiar with how these institutions operated. But what was really important to me was to situate the women in their community. So I really consulted Pension Bureau records first, because I needed to be able to identify claimants. And once I did that and start organizing, sort of patterns within the records, I then did a deep dive into local records. So also Freedmen's Bureau records, but a lot of Freedmen's Bureau bank records I found very useful. Census records were really helpful after I had consulted the government records, because, for example, women aren't noted on census records as union widows. And so I couldn't start with census records. But I also did some things that I think are creative. And again, the people that I write about always were leading me. And so I wanted to really contextualize their lives. And because death, disease was so prominent in the sources and in the discussion, dying and death was so prominent, I started to think about burial practices. I started to think about cemeteries. And so I also started to look a lot into national cemeteries. And so the community that I write about There's a national cemetery there. And I just started to have curiosities around, well, what would make a person decide to become buried in the national cemetery versus a community cemetery? You know, some people, probably not people in your audience, were surprised to learn that women are actually buried in the national cemeteries. And I was beginning to discover that through the pension files that I was looking at. So I would lastly say what I've found really useful is also, in addition to census records, obviously military records, but again, always sort of turning to these records, the sort of local records after I identified patterns. And so what I want to lastly say is that the landscape for this project is so different now because we have digital records and access to digital records. And so I was able in the latter phase of the project to do a lot with local newspapers in a way that I just wouldn't have been able to do without those research engines. And so access to those engines, where research engine was certainly important, but once I had the access, it helped me further contextualize the people that I was talking about. So, and then of course, pension records, as one colleague has described them, are feast or famine. So sometimes you don't get a lot, and sometimes you get a tremendous amount of medical records, you get personal letters. And so sometimes the records themselves just yielded even more sort of questions and answers and other kinds of sources that were embedded in the records. So, but that wasn't something that I could tell without pulling the records. So.
Yeah, that's a great point about the pension records sometimes being feast or famine. Just a word of, I don't know, warning or caution or whatever it is to any of you out there, if you've ever gone and done some research and been disappointed by the first few that you've taken a look at, never fear. Just push on and you'll probably find some good stuff eventually.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for kind of laying that out for us. I think that's a great example of, like you said, kind of letting your subjects kind of lead you to your next thing. You're looking at the pension record and say, well, there seems to be a lot of disease and sickness and, eventually death in these. Why not look at cemeteries then? I mean, really just kind of following that path. That's a great example of how that works. So getting specific now, I wonder if you would share some, and we're gonna kind of look at the story of Black women in Civil War medicine from a number of different angles. Let's start from the perspective of nurses. Do you have any stories, names, and things you want to highlight of Black women as nurses during the Civil War?
Yeah, so this is what I would say and sort of how I grappled with it. And I also want to say, make explicit with your audience, I'm a social historian, I'm not a medical historian, and yet these themes of medicine, health, disease, and dying are very prominent in the story that I tell. And I would say, firstly, I would lean on the secondary literature. Jane Schultz is really the sort of scholar who really breaks this open in terms of talking about not only nurses' pensions, but also the Nurses' Pensions Act. And so I was really captivated by her work, and it prompted a lot of questions in me in terms of how I might ask questions about the women that I was encountering in my study. And what I began to realize is that most of the women who were engaged in medical practices fell along a number of different lines. Some of them were traveling with their spouses during the war. And so literally the men are enlisting and they're traveling with their spouses. Probably not a new question for your audience. But what I also began to notice, and there's one story in the book that I trace throughout, a woman by the name of Louisa Powers. I became very interested in her case because her husband succumbed to death, I think around 1877. He had a variety of different illnesses. And she's obviously having to, under the general law pension system, demonstrate that he died as a result of his service-related injury. But she's also talking about how she cared for him during the war. And I found that really interesting. And then later in life, after she died, her son, in some of the petitions that he was filing, began to talk about her as a nurse. And I found that really interesting, that while the Pension Bureau or the military, in many cases, wouldn't recognize the work of spouses who were traveling with their husbands as nurses, that they were doing that kind of work. The other way that questions of nursing comes up in the records, again, feast or famine in pension records, oftentimes these are individuals who aren't even the petitioners. They're testifying for a range of different reasons. But there's a case in New Bern in particular where a woman just gives a very vivid description about the work that she was doing on behalf of soldiers to treat smallpox. And so she talked extensively about death and dying in the refugee camps. She talked extensively about the spread of smallpox and talked extensively about the practices she used to treat those illnesses. And then finally, there are people who would probably fall into the category that Schultz describes in her article. And I have to say, it was really, I had no sort of strategy when I went into the records to find these women. One of the women I actually found in the cemetery records at the National Cemetery in New Bern, Eastern North Carolina, where I write about, and I really just sort of stumbled upon her. The second person that I found was not successful in filing a petition, although she had significant documentation, testimony from white and Black soldiers that she had performed this labor, again, falling under Schultz's sort of categories. But I found her sort of embedded in the ledger books of a claims agent who represented Black soldiers' wives and widows during this period. And so if you were to go into the Civil War Pension Index, you will find Elizabeth Dempsey, but you won't find much more, right? And because she wasn't successful, I don't have a pension file from her, but I was fortunate that I had a bit about her story that was embedded in these ledger books. And I really still haven't fully constructed Elizabeth Dempsey's story, but it's a fascinating exchange that she has with Pension Bureau officials over securing benefits that ultimately were unsuccessful. But I think in terms of nursing and in terms of general interest, depending on audience today, I mean, the narrative of Susie King Taylor is what people usually turn to. And people also will be familiar with Harriet Tubman's story. And what I find fascinating about her case file is that she's making a claim on the basis not only of her services as a nurse, but also in terms of the work that she did on behalf of the Union in the field, as well as the sort of nursing care that she provided. So there are examples, but certainly in terms of, again, in terms of strategy or trying to just sort of, so, you know, it really was sort of happenstance when I came across these stories. So you've got some people who are doing the work, never getting recognition for that, but others who were hired by military officials, but ultimately their work was categorized outside of the category of nursing. So.
Yeah, I like that you highlighted that there really is a incredible variance of experience, not just for Black women and medical care in the Civil War, but also for women writ large in the Civil War. You know, there are people of both races that are, you know, paid to provide medical care. There are volunteers. There are people that are just kind of there, you know, doing, you know, traveling with the Army, and, you know, everything in between. So it's hardly a monolithic story. And, you know, whenever someone, you know, comes to the museum and says, tell us about, you know, women nurses during the Civil War, I mean, it's such a broad, there's such a broad answer to that, just as you highlighted.
It is. It's a very broad answer. Yeah.
And add on top of that, another name that you know that we've written about before on our blog, Anne Stokes was a Black woman who was a nurse on the USS Red Rover. So a naval medicine or naval nursing angle there as well. So there's just so many different kind of lenses at this. I wondered if we could zoom in a little bit about, you know, the kind of medical care and the the experience of Black women, wives of soldiers in the USCT, and what that was like. I would imagine that experience was not always, but probably often out of necessity, because of course, the experience of a lot of USCT soldiers and their families is intensely tenuous. They're kind of in a better spot than they were, certainly because they're being paid, and they're no longer in captivity. But it's still a little bit unclear what they will be, and especially what the status of their families is. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, so again, my story takes shape in Eastern North Carolina, but of course many of these themes can be traced in various parts of the South as the war is unfolding. And I initially began to think about this question from the perspective of refugee families in places like Roanoke Island and in particular New Bern. But there's also this post-war period where you have many soldiers that are coming home with disease, disability, and their wives are doing the principal care for their husbands. They're nursing wounds, they're bandaging soldiers, they're bathing them, they're feeding them. Vivid descriptions of paralysis. One woman whose name is escaping me now talked about her husband's amputation. So this sparked a lot of questions in my mind, and also that these women are having this conversation, oftentimes with the Bureau, sometimes where their husband is still alive, and they're making the case that their husbands aren't able to work and provide, and they need more provision. So of course this is very complicated. Oftentimes, what seems to be a recurring theme in a lot of the records that I looked at is that women didn't have access to their husbands didn't have access to medical care. In the case of New Bern, there were a couple of white doctors that were associated with the military, but there were also some local doctors that were returning to the area that treated Black soldiers. But oftentimes people would talk about them, they just couldn't get access to doctors, they couldn't get those records, and they couldn't afford that kind of care. And so oftentimes they perform the care. And so I talk about it in the book as a form of care labor, and a kind of labor that I think we are increasingly talking about in our society, but the work of care that women provided to their husbands who were increasingly in decline. And in addition to the illnesses, they also talk about the wage work that they're performing that in some cases strikes people as odd, that women are doing all this work outside of the home. Of course, Black women have been doing this work, working as domestics, doing this sort of work. And so oftentimes the women who are petitioning the government are and sometimes trying to position themselves as nurses and wanting to be recognized for that kind of labor, that kind of care labor, helping with cleaning the soldiers. There's also very much a community conversation. Again, I'm in Eastern North Carolina, where you have a large concentration of Black soldiers, wives, and widows. And the other thing that I found fascinating by looking at a community of soldiers and Black soldiers' families after the war is there becomes a sort of expectation around the care that these soldiers should receive, and expectations of soldiers' wives to perform that care labor. And when it was believed that women weren't living up to that ideal, communities would vocalize complaint to examiners from the Bureau, or sometimes women would hire other nursing assistants to come in and help. And so through the lens of care, I was also able to reconstruct community networks, and again, sort of piece together these stories. So
that's such a clever way to look at it. I think that the lens of care, whose job is it to look after these people, either soldiers or in your case, veterans. Yeah, that's I think a great way to, a really clever and interesting way to look at that. This is sort of a multi-part question that deals with, perhaps soldiers' wives, and then also about the medical care that, Black women may have provided in refugee camps, which is kind of another kind of subset of groupings where Black women are involved with the Civil War medical story. I've talked with a few different authors about Civil War refugee camps, Amy Merle Taylor and Chandra Manning and them, and I've asked them this as well, and the other part of that question is, what kind of medical care was provided by the federal government in this case, and was there, what sort of, with the, rather than the refugees turning to the white doctors, the white federal government doctors, was there more trust in amongst the community, and is that how Black women come into the story? Anyway, that's a inartfully worded question, but go ahead and speak to that if you would.
Yeah. Well, let me say that my colleagues Chandra and Amy are probably better well suited to answer this, but I will certainly take a stab at this, in part from the perspective of, I'm also thinking about Jim Downs as well, but I'm thinking about, the Freedmen's Bureau certainly had medical hospitals. There was a hospital that the Union officials had taken over in New Bern, and so there was certainly a hospital that people talked about, or at least sort of tents, or sort of a staged medical site where individuals were being treated. I mean, again, I got this sense from the records that one, there's a sense of that Blacks have a particular kind of immunity to certain kinds of diseases, smallpox, et cetera. And again, that care was turned over to the community. I think that's an interesting question about trust and sort of expertise. And even as I was talking about sort of what was happening in refugee camps, I mean, again, when I initially sort of introduced myself, I was thinking about sort of medical practices that enslaved people would use to treat one another under slavery. And so again, the woman I'm speaking about, her name is Flora Lucas, talks vividly about using lemons and water and the ways in which she was treating various soldiers. And certainly a number of women talk about that. But of course, my book really does unfold the sort of relationships, interaction with the government, issues around medical care unfolds in that post-war period. And what you do have is a cadre of few, not a lot, but a few, African Americans who are trained medical doctors who emerge in New Bern, that is later toward the latter part of the 19th century. And in some cases, I have them talking about their sort of medical expertise. But largely, either people talked about going untreated, or that kind of care was turned over to women in various sort of societies. So I'm thinking about the Grand Army Republic, the sort of in New Bern, there was a James Beecher section of the Grand Army Republic, which was a largely Black, what was a Black section of the GAR. And it was sort of in that capacity that various veterans did the work of going around and sort of surveying people in New Bern and talking about care and talking about need. And so again, I really sort of get at this question through the social lens of how care was distributed after the war. And there does seem to be a sense about, I don't know if I would have worded it as trust. I think that's really interesting. I tend to think about it and write about it as coming out of sort of mutual aid societies that Blacks are forming in the wake of the Civil War. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Well, I just talking, highlighting these kind of, like you said, these networks that start to kind of emerge, and the increasing numbers of Black doctors that exist in kind of the local level. We have a book here at the museum that we published called Prologue to Change, and it's about the 13 African-American surgeons who served during the Civil War. I mean, initially that number is so low because they're prohibited from getting a medical degree in the United States, but that starts to change in the years after the Civil War, and so there's more opportunity, and so more people do, and so the story that you kind of laid out is sort of maybe the seeds get planted during the Civil War, and the necessity of the care for all of these veterans and communities writ large starts to expand and blossom, as it were.
Yeah. One thing that I would
Obviously, it's
add,
a little bit more complicated than that, but that's maybe the grand narrative arc, as it were.
yeah, I mean, one thing that I would add that I'm increasingly curious about, I write about to a limited extent, but I'm increasingly interested in because my story, starts to stretch into the 20th century. I could begin to see and chart the illnesses that soldiers' wives died from. A lot of heart attacks, a lot of stress-related illness that their death certificates are documenting. So I think that's a new sort of frontier of research that might, that people would think about as well. Certainly something that I'm thinking about as I move forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle, because I mean, I think one of the things the pandemic has certainly highlighted for all of us, it's that the impact of a sickness, disease, wound, death, whatever it is, goes so far beyond the actual
That's right.
patient, victim, etc. It extends both, of course, to the people in their familial and social orbit, but also it dramatically impacts the caregivers. And we've talked a lot today about the lens of care, and we try and strike a balance here at the museum, and it's not an easy one to strike well, but to strike a balance between highlighting the story of the patient as well as the the doctor or caregiver, because you can't really have one without the other. And so it's easy to focus on one instead of the other, so that it's hard to highlight them both. So yeah, I think that would be a fascinating angle.
Yeah.
Well, in the post-war years, of course, your book is all about Black women interacting with the pension office, claiming union womanhood. And you talk about this interaction with the federal government, and you're making an argument about why this is so important, why the story needs to be told. What is that? Why is that story so important?
So for me, I was prompted to think about these questions because so much of what we understand about late 19th century political culture has been constructed through the lens of middle-class African Americans. The study isn't to say that we shouldn't have that work, we should, but I had a sense that the landscape of political activism and political action was much broader and complicated. I was also prompted to think about these questions because of, quite frankly, excellent work by scholars in the field of African American women's history, as well as Southern women's history, gender studies, law and legal studies. I was reading very, very broadly, and I thought that this might be possible. This story is important. One, when I started it, I should back up. I wasn't thinking necessarily that to write about African American Civil War widows or Black soldiers' wives was an analytical intervention. I came to understand that analytical intervention, and I'm still coming to understand that intervention. But I think at the time, I wasn't thinking that. I mean, it was odd that when I was putting in Black Union widows or Black, that spiders were coming up on Google, but I wasn't thinking in terms of that this was so earth-shattering, because certainly other people had written about, certainly in the Freedmen's Bureau records and studies that had emerged from that, had talked about Black soldiers' wives. I certainly wasn't the first to write it using pension records, but I really started to think about African American Union widows, and union widowhood as a theoretical category, because it sets up a conversation about equality. And I think that some people, probably not in your audience, but some people may be surprised to know that African American union widows existed, because people don't think about Black soldiers' wives. They think about Black enlistment, Black soldiers' wives, but more importantly, in the late 19th century, they are petitioning the government on the basis of their status for benefits that they have been promised on the basis of their husband's service. And for a long time, that's under the general law pension system, which requires them to explain and demonstrate their husband's service-related injury or death as a result of military service. And so women are constantly talking about disease and illness, and they're constantly having to learn that language. But when they begin to petition, many are not successful, but many are. And many in the community that I write about are. And sometimes they are on, so initially, and I'm thinking about so many colleagues that have done sort of extraordinary work that really made my study possible. I'm thinking about Nora Lee Frankel. I'm thinking about Leslie Schwalm. I'm thinking about David Schaefer. I'm thinking about Elizabeth Rigason. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but I'm thinking about their work. And in terms of, the story was sort of, well, look, African-American women, former slaves, are making claims and they're successful. But when I began to trace them further into the late 19th century, I saw that sometimes their period of collecting benefits was very short. Sometimes they're appealing and stretching, contesting decisions made by the Pension Bureau. And it really sort of opened up the sort of what I call the politics of these pensions, and the kind of politics that they were engaging, that really sort of reverberated around intersections around and ideas around what union widowhood was. And part of the point that I'm trying to make in this book is that the women that I write about had a sense of themselves as worthy widows. They believed themselves to be deserving and worthy. And they made petitions on the basis of those ideas of womanhood that oftentimes were in conflict, not only with the Pension Bureau, but sometimes with the communities that they live within. And so I really am not trying to say this is the final point, but rather I'm trying to even further complicate what we know about Black communities and gender and Black communities in the post-emancipation South. And I think what this story does is, Lynn, not only allow us to see the sort of everyday lives of these women, the institutions that they participated in, but also for us to really see over long stretches of time that they really sort of engaged in these activities, which we can see as legal activities, and really had an astute consciousness about how they were not only filing petitions, but how they're interacting with bureau officials who are oftentimes situated in their communities. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I want to highlight, two things in there that you noted. Of course, Abraham Lincoln famously in the Gettysburg Address uses the phrase "a new birth of freedom," which is such a compelling, pithy little turn of phrase to kind of talk about the best aspirations of kind of what the Civil War produces and is about and all that sort of thing. But of course, it's also painfully vague as well. And so part of what you're kind of getting at is that there are these Black widows who are aggressively trying to note that the new birth of freedom includes them as well, which is, of course, a hugely important thing when it comes to the legacy of the Civil War and all that.
It is extremely complicated, but John, I have to tell you, I really like the way you put that. I wrote that I wrote that down because, of course, this discussion, there's a way in which when you study policy or sort of when laws come about, you can set up these sort of nice chronologies, but women are complaining. They're writing to Lincoln complaining about the problems with the pension system. And for formerly enslaved women in particular, who don't have the records to prove their marital relations with soldiers, they're complaining about, being ineligible, for not being able to establish their claims. And it's really not until the Fort Pillow Massacre in 1864, in April of 1864, that Lincoln is really pushed to think about this question and exclusion of African-American soldiers, wives, and widows during this period. And so a policy is created, a set of policies is created, and they have those policies have to be honed, but allows for a pathway or inroad for women to ultimately make the kind of claims that I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And the other angle that I think is so wonderful about your research is that you trace these stories long into the 1800s. And we here at the museum say that Civil War battles don't really end when the guns fall silent. They have the impact stretched for days, weeks, months, and in many cases years beyond. Oftentimes when I say that, I'm talking about soldiers being treated on the battlefield and field hospitals and nearby. But with the pension system, and even just the kind of physical and emotional impact, it goes for the rest of their lives.
That's right.
And so that's why sometimes people think about the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and one way you can react to our institution is, wow, that's kind of a niche topic, and in some ways it is, but also it can expand well beyond 1865, and so that's why I think your research you're smart in setting it up that way.
I really I agree, and I like the way that you put this in terms of battles. I mean, there was another piece that I did. It's a short sort of academic minute that I did, but I call it the battle for survivors' benefits. But this is really about legacies of the Civil War, right? That sometimes women are talking about their experiences during the war and the legacies of those experiences. But to further complicate it, right, is that these women are also dealing with the legacies and traumas of enslavement. And so what you get as they're petitioning is women confronting Pension Bureau officials with ideas of and constructions of womanhood that they created to survive during these incredibly violent and traumatic moments and experiences of transition. Add to that they're making these petitions in this transition to free labor society. So that even complicates these ideas even further, setting up households, thinking about what family is, and really sort of experimenting and thinking about what freedom is going to be for them in this moment, how they're going to define it, how they're going to set up community, and grappling with these kinds of illnesses and diseases that come out of the Civil War. So it's a very complicated story. I tried to do my best with it in terms of parsing out themes. But I like the way that you put this in terms of legacies of the Civil War. And that's really sort of how I situate my work in terms of larger conversations.
And in some ways, that's the beauty of this all, because I'm certain that you would be the first to say that there's so much more to be done on this subject. And as I think we've demonstrated, there's so many different really interesting angles that you can get at some of these questions from. And so it's great job security for you and I, if nothing else, and for a number of other folks still to come. So there's so many different angles to continue tackling this topic.
Absolutely.
As we kind of come to a close here, I know I've really enjoyed this conversation. Do you want to end? Do you have any final word? Anything that we didn't kind of touch on that you wanted to make sure you mention? Any hopes for future research or what people get out of the project? Just so anything you want to kind of close us with.
Yeah, so I guess I would say a few things. And as you were talking in terms of thinking about sort of approaches to research in the midst of this pandemic, So much of my work took place at the National Archives. I am forever indebted to the staff who pulled so many records for me, many who I came to know over time, at least on a face-to-face basis, but not necessarily on a name basis. A lot of just a lot of staff that helped me literally from the day-to-day getting in. And I think about, you know, the changes that have come because of the pandemic. And there are certainly ways to access pension files, which is what I began with through Fold 3 and Ancestries. I know that your audience will be familiar with. But it really does mean that the approaches are going to have to, change a bit in sort of how we sort of think about this. And it's really interesting that, folks can go to Fold 3 to get documents, although that requires a membership. And so how this research is done is really crucial. But I also was thinking, not necessarily of the professional, but of actually the professional genealogists that do this incredible work that I've benefited from so much. Sort of local organizations, historical societies that are continuing to raise and sort of preserve the history of Black soldiers and their families. My biggest hope would be that people would, when they encounter pension files, I know in most cases, a lot of cases, people are really interested in the story of the soldiers, but I hope that they'll dig a little deeper and look into the narratives and testimonies of the women involved, because oftentimes I found that they oftentimes led me to other soldiers, to other women, and they helped me sort of understand the complexity of the moment that they were living in. And I was actually really stunned. I mean, I don't want to suggest that I'm the first person to do this work. There were many that went before me, and it is because of their work that I was able to accomplish this. But I often find that I was often surprised that people haven't really sort of dug into the other half of these files, that women themselves, the sort of afterlife of the Civil War, the legacies of the wars that the women themselves had to contend with in terms of care labor, in terms of how disease and illness impacted their households. So my hope is that my book and this discussion will just spark more questions for terrific research. And I'll look forward to reading and gaining insight from folks from your audience.
If there's anything we historian types like, it's more questions. You can never have too many of those.
Never, ever.
Well, this has been wonderful, Brandi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. We hope you all out there enjoyed it, wherever and whenever you're watching. So if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit the like button. That's an easy, free way to support us. Lets us know that you like this content. Lets us know that you want more of this content. So go ahead and hit the like button if you enjoyed the program. Hit the subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with all the latest programming that we do here on our YouTube channel. And if you want to take your support another level, you can become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And as I think you were just talking about, Brandi, supporting your local historic institutions, whether they be a museum, historic society, genealogical society, they're doing great work out there, and even small donations can go a long way to help support those entities. So we would certainly appreciate your financial contributions, but if you want to give to a group that's a little bit closer to you than we are, that's perfectly understandable too. Just if you're watching this, odds are you're interested in historic scholarship, so support that however you can. We'd love it if it was us, but it could be anyone else too. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. So this is John and Brandi signing off.